It happened at 9 p.m. in Jerusalem. Benjamin Netanyahu, live on air, slammed Britain with a sweeping ban, branding the UK an unreliable ally after Starmer's shock ICC endorsement and total arms embargo. Top diplomats were blindsided, flights were turned back, and overnight, half a century of intelligence and defence ties simply vanished. The stakes, terror threats, frozen investments, reputational freefall. But what really pushed Israel to block Britain, and how did it all unravel so fast? At precisely 9 p.m. in Jerusalem, the voice of Benjamin Netanyahu carried across Israel's main networks. The Prime Minister, flanked by senior security officials, announced an immediate suspension of entry for all UK government representatives. The words he chose, security quarantine, rang with finality. For decades, British diplomats and defence envoys had moved freely through Israeli ministries and military headquarters. In one stroke, that access vanished. Netanyahu's statement was direct and unforgiving, calling Britain an unreliable ally and warning that the UK's government could no longer be trusted with Israeli security interests. The scope of the ban was total, no exceptions for intelligence, defence or diplomatic channels. Israeli officials were ordered to halt all meetings, cancel briefings and freeze joint operations with their British counterparts. The announcement landed like a shockwave in London, where officials scrambled for answers. Within minutes, embassy phones rang unanswered and encrypted lines fell silent. The diplomatic vacuum was immediate, leaving the UK's foreign policy establishment cut off from one of its most critical partners in the region. 4 days before the Israeli ban, Keir Starmer made a decision that would redefine Britain's position in the Middle East. Standing before cameras at Downing Street, he declared full support for International Criminal Court arrest warrants against Israel's senior leadership. The announcement was swift and uncompromising. Starmer confirmed a total arms embargo on Israel, extending far beyond offensive weaponry. Even defensive systems, components for the Iron Dome, radar units, encrypted communications gear, were swept up in the ban. The move bypassed the Foreign Office and intelligence chiefs. Key ministers learned of the policy through press leaks and Israeli protests, not from internal briefings. Allies in Washington and Brussels watched in disbelief as Britain, once a cornerstone of Western security partnerships, appeared to sever its most sensitive defence ties. For Israeli officials, the embargo was seen as an act of abandonment. For Whitehall, the decision triggered a scramble, as the realities of a moral stand collided with the practical cost of strategic isolation. Dame Barbara Woodward, Britain's ambassador in Tel Aviv, sat in her office as urgent messages from Israeli officials arrived before any word from London. For the Foreign Office, the first confirmation of the Israeli ban came not from Downing Street, but from the Israeli protest itself. Calls to Number 10 went unanswered. Inside Whitehall, senior aides drafted resignation letters as the gravity of the situation became clear. Within hours, the usual channels of communication, secure lines, diplomatic cables, encrypted chats, were flooded with confusion. Then, in a move that stunned observers, Foreign Secretary David Lammy's government jet, already en route to Tel Aviv, was denied landing rights mid-flight. Public flight trackers traced the aircraft's abrupt turn over the Mediterranean, broadcasting the diplomatic humiliation in real time. The machinery of British diplomacy, built on routine and protocol, found itself outpaced by events. Officials who once relied on decades of established procedures now faced a cascade of unanswered questions and institutional shock, their authority undercut by a crisis unfolding faster than they could respond. Inside the headquarters of Mossad and Britain's intelligence agencies, protocols shifted in real time. Israeli command authorised a full suspension of all data pipelines feeding into UK systems. Secure servers hosting joint threat assessments were disconnected. Analysts on both sides, accustomed to daily information flows, faced blank screens and revoked credentials. The frameworks that once enabled seamless sharing of signals intelligence, cyber threat warnings and human source reporting, valued at over £12 billion, went dark. Mossad issued internal directives reclassifying the United Kingdom as a security liability, instructing staff to halt all communication with British partners. Automated alerts flagged UK digital signatures for exclusion from Israeli defence networks. Joint operations, from counter-terror tracking to cyber defence drills, were cancelled without notice. The mechanics of cooperation, built over decades, unravelled in hours, leaving both countries' agencies isolated and operationally blind to shared threats. The silence left by Israel's withdrawal quickly turned into a sense of exposure. For years, British security had depended on Israeli intelligence to intercept threats that rarely made the headlines. 17 terror plots, quietly dismantled before they could reach British streets, now hang as an unspoken warning. Cyber defence firms in Tel Aviv once monitored the digital pulse of London's power grids and financial networks. Overnight, those data feeds stopped. Sir Alex Younger, the former head of MI6, described it as a strategic amputation, a voluntary severing of the nation's senses. At street level, families and officials alike began to question who was watching their backs. The invisible shield that had protected daily life was gone, replaced by a growing unease. With every hour, the absence of Israeli alerts left a widening gap, one that hostile actors could already sense. The risk was no longer abstract. It was personal, immediate, and unguarded. Regional capitals moved quickly behind closed doors. Gulf envoys from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain delivered private messages of support to Israeli officials, describing Britain's move as reckless and destabilising. In the corridors of the Gulf Cooperation Council, diplomats openly questioned whether London could be trusted in future security partnerships. The diplomatic chill spread west. In Washington, intelligence officials began reassessing the UK's standing within the Five Eyes alliance. A senior CIA source, speaking off the record, put it bluntly: if forced to choose between London and Jerusalem, we already had Qom. On social media, the hashtag Britain betrays allies surged to the top of global trends, echoing in capitals from Paris to Riyadh. NATO allies, already uneasy, watched as Britain's reputation for reliability slipped away in real time. The sense of isolation grew, not just through official statements, but in the quiet, urgent diplomacy now unfolding far from public view. Global markets reacted with ruthless speed. Within minutes of the Israeli ban, sterling fell sharply against the shekel, with traders citing a sudden loss of confidence in Britain's diplomatic stability. Bilateral trade worth nearly £30 billion now hung in the balance, as investors pulled back from both defence and technology sectors. Israeli venture capital, a major force in London's tech scene, froze £4 billion in pending investments overnight. Analysts at Bloomberg warned that the City of London faced its most severe credibility test since the Brexit shock. Rafael Advanced Defence Systems, Israel's flagship defence firm, announced the immediate cancellation of contracts valued in the billions. The news sent shockwaves through biotech and cyber firms, with joint projects on both sides of the Mediterranean. Former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo weighed in, calling the financial fallout the price of losing trusted alliances. For Britain, the cost was no longer theoretical. It was measured in contracts lost, markets rattled, and a currency suddenly exposed. MI5 briefers gathered in Whitehall, their latest assessment blunt and unsettling. With Israeli intelligence cut off, hostile networks wasted no time. Security chiefs reported that Iranian-linked groups were already probing for weaknesses across Britain's digital and physical borders. The warning was explicit. Without the usual alerts from Tel Aviv, the country's defences were running blind. Inside Downing Street, a wave of internal polling arrived. Labour's numbers, once steady, had collapsed into the teens. The opposition surged past 50%, fueled by public anger and fear. On the streets, anxiety rippled through communities that once felt protected. Jewish leaders convened emergency meetings, their calls for guidance now met with silence. Synagogue security teams, accustomed to quiet support from Israeli advisors, faced the prospect of going it alone. Families questioned whether the government could still guarantee their safety. The unease was not confined to policy debates or party lines. It seeped into daily life, reshaping trust and exposing the cost of sudden isolation. At 9 p.m. Jerusalem time, Prime Minister Netanyahu's live broadcast made history. For the first time, UK officials were banned from Israel following Keir Starmer's public support for International Criminal Court arrest warrants and a total arms embargo. Within hours, Israeli intelligence suspended £12 billion in cooperation, and Mossad labelled the UK a security risk. Documents confirm 17 terror plots on British soil were previously stopped with Israeli help. Now, that protection is gone. Bilateral trade worth £30 billion hangs in the balance, with £4 billion in tech investment frozen overnight. Inside the UK, MI5 warnings and polling show a government in crisis, while Jewish communities report deep fear and rising emigration inquiries. Yet, key details remain classified: the full extent of intercepted threats, and whether allies will restore lost trust. What is certain is this: Britain now faces a level of strategic vulnerability and diplomatic isolation not seen in decades, all triggered by a single, unconsulted decision.